Thank you very much for that very warm welcome. For those of you who haven't met me before, you might be interested to know that I was a bookseller in York for over 30 years. I've been a member of Dringhouses Parish Church for 40 years. And in the last 20 years, I've been involved with local history, particularly in Dringhouses. And my own interest is in personalities who bring aspects of history to life. So with that in mind, let me introduce you to Annabel Dott, who came to Dringhouses as the wife of the local vicar. I discovered her when I was researching the story of the parish church a few years ago. She's a perfect example of a woman whose life illustrates the changing times and opportunities for someone of her background and era. We'll see that it's the life of a remarkable woman, or if we use the language of some of the Victorian novelists of her youth, the true tale of opportunities embraced. I'm sure you know that the long drawn out plots of such novels were often published in monthly episodes. I'm sorry tonight you're not going to get monthly episode. We're going to have a few glimpses of her life in the short time we have together, but they do illustrate the period in which she lived. And like the novels, we'll see examples of disadvantages overcome, inspiration, and determination. But this isn't a novel, it's a true story. She was christened Sarah Frances Annabel in Stepney in 1868, the daughter of a customs officer, Robert Hall, and his wife, who incidentally originally came from Newcastle. Annabel had a comfortable middle-class home, but with the disadvantages of most girls of her time, you know, the typical Victorian restrictions, but more importantly, no legal independence from father or husband, and no opportunities for the same level of education offered to boys. Sadly, her father died before her 3rd birthday, leaving her destined to be the single child of her widowed mother, and only the prospect of being her mother's companion, unless she found a husband or a career, though very few careers were yet available for girls of her background and education. So this slide shows us Stepney in relation to the Docklands, where her father's job took him. Of course, I'm sure the picture on the left, you're very familiar with that loop of the Thames, and you can see the various docks shown either side of that loop. Now, just above the loop, can you see a triangle of yellow roads clearly marked just above the loop? A large triangle, that is the Stepney area, and the slide on the right is a close-up of the same area. And you'll see going across the picture from left to right, Mile End, the road going from bottom, halfway down the left-hand side, right to the top corner. At one end, the left-hand end, we'll see Whitechapel and Stepney a little further up. Her first home, where she was born, was very close to Mile End Road. One advantage Annabel did inherit, however, was an enterprising nature from her maternal grandmother, who crops up now and again in her story. Annabel obviously grew up in a vibrant multicultural area where she had opportunities to observe the bustling life and development of the expanding city. We all like to watch the development of a bustling city, don't we? Think of York Station at the moment. Every time we go past, people are talking about what has changed, what is happening, who's doing the right thing, who's doing the wrong thing. It would be the same in Annabel's time. So she could see all this development going around where she lived. And Charles Booth's map of London that we see here, two views of it, was developed to show the different types of housing and social class. The area on the left was the area where she lived when she was born. In the center of the picture, can you see a letter N? If you can you navigate to the center, a large letter N? That is a square called Beaumont Square, and you'll see that it is partly red, partly pink, but a little bit of greenery behind, and then poorer areas to the side. Because the red denotes wealthy properties, pink less affluent, down through blue to black being the poorest. They were able to live in reasonable housing because of her father's job, but also they had some family money. Looking at the other picture, it shows you Amherst Road going down the centre from left down to the right-hand corner. Can you see Amherst Road? You'll see immediately it's a different type of housing, all red and nice gardens laid out beside. For almost 30 years, that's where her family home would be. Of course, her father died before she was 3, so it's just her and her mother. It was in an area where the old brickworks had once been, providing the very building materials for the expanding types of housing which were needed as transport links spread further out from the city. She would be very much aware of the new developments all around her area, as speculative builders bought land and built on it. But what could the future hold for a girl like her? Well, in her teenage years, she came under the influence of Canon and Mrs. Barnett at the famous settlement in Whitechapel, founded in 1884, known as Toynbee Hall. Interestingly, Henrietta Barnett is the only person that Annabel ever references as having influenced her. But we will see that other people, mostly men, influenced her. But it's nice that she particularly mentioned Henrietta, who also, of course, was a clergy wife. The principles at Toynbee Hall of helping the disadvantaged to help themselves, primarily by means of education and cultural pursuits, would be a lifelong influence on Annabel. Henrietta Barnett, of course, is best remembered for her influence on the Garden City movement before World War I. For girls like Annabel, the last few decades of the 19th century saw a growing movement in support of opportunities for women, with gradual legal reforms and improved standards of education, leading eventually, for comparatively few, to university-level studies. However, the movement for female suffrage and professional career opportunities for women would be slow to follow. Nevertheless, Annabel was in the ideal location to make contacts and learn of the new ideas and hopes which were circulating. At the age of 19, she enrolled at University College London as an arts, law, and science student. I'm not sure whether she was intending to take one of those as her main subject later on. Perhaps it's what we now know as an access course, but they have records of her enrolling there. However, for unknown reasons, perhaps the health of her mother or lack of finance, she didn't continue after the first year. Annabel and her mother had moved to this property in Bournemouth around 1893-4, probably due to her mother's failing health. Although Bournemouth was already known as a popular health resort, enterprising businessmen were now keenly promoting the area as a wonderful opportunity for investment. Investment was their watchword, with building developments of various types being undertaken. Interestingly, just a little bit further down the road from this house, young William Reynolds, a close neighbour of the Halls, was then starting on his career as an architect with the firm who would be responsible for many of those versatile developments taking place in Bournemouth over the next decade. Now, William's sister was Annabel's age, so they would probably have known each other quite well. And if there were sort of social interactions, if they'd gone round to visit the family, Annabel may well have been introduced to some of the things that young William was working on, and he would no doubt be very excited about what developments were going to be happening. There were a lot of holiday homes opening in Bournemouth as well, of course, but they did large buildings as well, several churches, the family that he was working for. Now, no doubt these developments that he would be talking about revive some stories that Annabel was personally developed with from the experiences of her maternal grandparents. Here they are again. They had been successful building speculators in 19th century Newcastle. And perhaps she wistfully envied William's opportunities to train as an architect as she was hearing about them. It was not until after her mother's death in 1903 that she was able to announce her engagement to the Reverend Patrick Dott, an Anglican clergyman who'd gone out to a parish in Cape Town in 1904. Woodstock is part of Cape Town. Now, Patrick's father had also been a customs officer in London, just like Annabel's, and it's probable that the families had known each other well over many years. We've no idea how their relationship developed. Annabel was a very elusive woman. We have very little to find out about her personal life. But their engagement was arranged, and she went out to join him in South Africa. And they were married in January 1906 in this church that you can see on the right of the screen, St. Mary's in Woodstock. The rectory was an earlier Victorian building behind the church itself. And behind that, can you just see Table Mountain? That's what she eventually was able to look out on. Incidentally, the church here and several others in South Africa had been built to designs taken out there by Sophie Gray, a self-taught architect, another woman from the Northeast, who was the wife of the first Bishop of Cape Town, just a few decades before the Dotts arrived. And Sophie, she was from a wealthier background, and so she again was able to finance herself training to be an architect, but not obviously officially recognized. But her husband's job enabled her to do a lot of work in South Africa. She's still remembered today. They have annual lectures commemorating her and her work. So I'm sure that every time Annabel was in this church, she was thinking, Sophie Gray, she had something to do with this. So perhaps that was another seed sown. Now, this is an extract taken from a later view with Annabel. So let me read what the interviewer was saying. Mrs. Dott has been interested in building since her girlhood. And if difficulties had not barred the way, there is no doubt she would have developed into a woman architect. This avenue having been closed to her, she became a master builder instead, and practically single-handed has seized some unusual opportunities. Further down in the interview, these are Annabel's own words. It was not until after my marriage that I was able to build. The first years of my married life were spent in South Africa, where my husband was rector of St. Mary's, Woodstock, Cape Town. And it was on his rectory and schools that I first exercised my, what she called her, apprentice hand. One of the things I like about her was he allowed her to put a window in the room at the rear of the rectory, quite high up in the room, so that she would have a lovely view of Table Mountain. So, and she did other internal alterations too, and work on the church schools. So we learned that Annabel's own building career took off once her husband allowed her to redesign some of the rectory and repair the dilapidated church schools. By offering her this opportunity, Patrick was to set in motion a career that she would later revel in. In the full interview, published 15 years later, she spelled out her early trial and error experiences here. Interestingly, using untrained local workers, which I think is significant. So she eagerly grasped those opportunities offered, even though she had no professional training and had limited facilities. It was the restoration of the treaty house in their parish which she found the most interesting work. This was the very place where in 1806 the Dutch general had signed the treaty by which the Cape was ceded to the English, hence the name, Treaty House. It had fallen into disrepair. It was being used by the church for various purposes, but she valued its heritage and was proud to preserve it for the future. Sadly, today it no longer survives, but this ancient tree on the original site is still there. And so it's one of South Africa's, favourite of our prime heritage places that you can go and look. So the mixture of influence and opportunity continues to develop. During her time in South Africa, she would absorb much from the Dutch culture. Lots of the houses were built in a Dutch style, obviously, from the original settlers. And later projects of hers would incorporate elements from that influence. Annabel and Patrick returned to the UK in 1909, and Annabel was pregnant. Sadly, I should say that her husband attributed their return to her ill health, which she put down to overwork. But in view of later developments, I wonder if she might have suffered a miscarriage. She would be she was quite late getting married, so she was in her early 40s by then. So when she came back to Dringhouses, this is what the parish church looks like on the left. It's very similar now, but lots of other buildings around it. And that's what the vicarage used to look like. Again, that's been replaced. And when they were appointed to Dringhouses, Annabel was finally pregnant. So it must have been a real source of joy for them. And she would be back in England for the birth of the baby. But sadly, it was a little girl born prematurely and stillborn. And they had no further children. It was a huge disappointment and a further toll on Annabel's health. They rented a cottage in Goathland where she could spend time recovering, while Patrick got on with his parish duties in Dringhouses. But being Annabel, she didn't waste another opportunity. She used the time to read and study for the Clerk of Works building exam, which involved reading technical books on things such as cottage building, plumbing, draining, brickmaking, and joinery. And she also joined the golf club there, benefiting from the fresh air and exercise. During the Dott's time in Dringhouses, they would have regular contact with a number of influential people. You might recognise one or two of these. The gentleman on the left was Colonel Wilkinson, Lord of the Manor, who lived next door to the vicarage. Someone who actually remembered him told me he was the local form of God. And still revered today. He lived next door, but more importantly for Annabel, his Colonel Wilkinson's wife, Caroline, was a keen supporter of women's suffrage. And then in the centre, do you recognise him? That was the young Archbishop Lang, Cosmo Gordon Lang, who incidentally was a former Bishop of Stepney, where he had known Patrick, Annabel's wife, and he referred to his friendship with Patrick in later years, as he was now at Bishopthorpe, and obviously Patrick's boss. And the gentleman on the right, anybody recognise him? That's Arnold Rowntree, the Quaker MP, obviously not a member of the parish church, as he was a Quaker, but his house, Chalfonts, was one of the big villas from Tadcaster Road overlooking the Knavesmire. And we know that through Arnold, Annabel would have useful contact with the Rowntree family, their support for women's suffrage, and their recently built village of New Earswick, seen below, and the philosophy behind it. These were all people that it was very useful to know if you were nobody. You could have links with people. And so contact with them and other people in the area would be an influence on Annabel's next project. At last, she had an opportunity to build rather than restore. And she says she turned herself into a builder. Shall I read this to you? When we came back to Yorkshire, I turned myself into a builder. I began building my house and 9 freehold cottages from my own designs, fitting each with modern appliances. How did she know about those? And every device to save labour. Sure she would know about those. I had to be patient and convince everybody that I meant business. You have to read into her phrases that she uses. I had to be patient. There were snide remarks about her almost throughout her life, but they started here in Goathland. Who did she think she was? Where was she getting the money from? Why don't they use a proper architect? What's she up to now? What's in that? What are they bringing back from the station? What can we see in that pony and cart that she's bringing into the village? And who would work for her? She was a woman. She wasn't a qualified architect. I had to be patient and convince everybody I meant business. So she encountered problems engaging people to work for her and financing her building projects. As a vicarage, of course, is really just a tied cottage, she took the opportunity to design a house, the one top left, for herself and Patrick in Goathland, incorporating several very clever ideas. She was able to finance this house with her own money, inherited from that maternal grandmother, but required the support of her husband to obtain a mortgage for the group of cottages bottom right, which were intended to be let as holiday lets. It wasn't until 1975 that we women were able to get a mortgage without the support or guarantee of a male guarantor. So again, she was unusual. People knew she was a vicar's wife, didn't they? I think, even from my own time, I've heard this said about vicar's wife. Why are they working? Why have they got a career of their own? And this was, of course, just before World War I. She called her house there on the left, the Stone House. She had a very clear idea of what she wanted her design to be for the Stone House, but she did follow the advice of a shrewd manager of a neighbouring estate. He advised her to build it Yorkshire, following the tradition of a long, low building in warm grey stone with mullioned windows and red handmade tiles, so that the exterior harmonised with the moorland setting. Initially, she incorporated several very practical details. I haven't time to tell you all about them now, but they reveal a female approach. One I like particularly, when you went into the entrance hall, there was a cupboard with a radiator, and the radiator was just below the clothes pegs where you hung your wet coat when you'd been out on the wet moors. That was very practical. She knew what was necessary. And she also had a boiler fitted in an outside scullery, so that when they were absent from the house, when she was down here in York, somebody could go in to check that the heating was on or everything was okay, while the rest of the house was locked up. Can you see the double front door in the centre of the ground floor there? I've actually been inside the house, and it's really clever because it's a double door and it opens wide inside and a stone floor, so that when it was on the occasion in Goathland, when there was a warm summer's day, you could open it and entertain almost in an open air situation. She was particularly fond of the oak panelling in the parlour. One of you here has a picture of that oak panelling, which you might actually share with others afterwards. She said that she sourced it from a house in Micklegate in York. I have not been able to determine which house this was. A lot of the houses in Micklegate have changed their interiors, haven't they, or restoration. It would be about 1911. So if any of you have any ideas, I would be interested to know. Anywhere any churches were being demolished or reordered, she'd be down there tying up bits and things. There was a yacht in Whitby that was being broken up, and she went to get bunk beds out of that yacht, which she incorporated into the top floor of this house. She was always on the lookout. She was at country sales and everything, which is why people thought that she was so extreme, and not what you would normally expect of a vicar's wife. She later wrote in great detail about this house in the Architectural Review in August 1918, highlighting the modern features which made it easy to run. Towards the end of World War I, she and her husband were increasingly concerned about the challenges facing the country's post-war reconstruction, and particularly the plight of disabled officers who would survive, but who would be prevented from returning to their professional careers. She saw that group of holiday lets that were in the previous picture as an ideal place that would suit men who would want to recover and have a comfortable family life due to the labour-saving style of her designs. Harking back to the Toynbee Hall philosophy of helping people to help themselves, and the principle that both the built and natural environment have an effect on well-being, this settlement, known as the Orchard, was proposed as a method of enabling officers to set up rural businesses which might help them, but also support the local economy at the same time. There's a lot about that in the chapter in the book and the ways that she suggested. Now, it's partly due to the guidance of Archbishop Lang, who we've just seen, that they were offered, and the initial contact with the Lord Lieutenant of the North Riding of Yorkshire, Sir Hugh Bell, that you can see there, that set the scheme in motion, and local architect Walter Briley's practice in York, drawing up plans for suitable alterations. Coincidentally, Walter Briley, whom I'm sure you recognise on the left, was living in Dringhouses parish at the time and was a member of the church. And the project was formalised by the creation of a company, the Goathland Homes for Officers, and passed out of Annabel's own control. Incidentally, Sir Hugh Bell, I don't know whether you know much about him, but he was his family was the 6th wealthiest in Britain at the time. They were steel workers from Middlesbrough, and he had his daughter, very famous daughter, was Gertrude Bell, who actually was just about 6 weeks older than Annabel. I like to think that maybe when he met Annabel, he thought, oh, well, my Gertrude's off in Saudi Arabia and all over the place, but you remind me of her because you've got get up and go. You're a girl who was, doing something with her life. But it was that generous gift of the Orchard cottages which brought Annabel national acclaim, as newspapers around the country and abroad picked up reports and began to refer to her as a woman architect, although she always made clear in articles she wrote herself that she was self-trained. At that time, of course, the profession was reluctant to admit women to their ranks. But newspaper coverage also gave Annabel the opportunity to publish her own ideas about women as architects and the type of work they might undertake. This is what they look like today. The top 3 pictures are the Goathland cottages, which were the Orchard. They were used by the officers and their families until about 1930, and then they went back into private ownership. And some of them are actually still holiday lets today. At the bottom shows the stone house, the gateway and the door itself. And it has been very sensitively enlarged at the moment. The people who own it now are doing actually really careful work, beautiful work on it, and are very kindly. The owners of that house and the orchard cottages have been very helpful to us, letting us see what they're like inside. More stories about that when there's time. In 1919, Patrick moved down to a parish in Croydon, where for a short time Annabel became a member of the Women's Pioneer Housing Group. They provided low-rent flats in London for single professional women, largely in converted properties. Why was that necessary? Because they were single women, couldn't be guaranteed to stay in a job. Would they be able to pay their rent? Landlords didn't want to let to them, so this organisation stepped in. And in this interview, I won't read this one in full, but Annabel says, reconstruction and conversion I find quite interesting, but building is really my bent. She'd worked on other houses and rectory, two in London she worked on, but she had something else in her mind. In 1920, while they were in Croydon, she bought a large property in the parish, which she adapted for the same purpose as the WPH, and she also designed a parish room next to their vicarage, still in use, but she was keen to move on to a more demanding project. By 1921, she had an opportunity to purchase 50 acres of land at Grey Wood in East Sussex, where she could build on her earlier experience at Goathland in an ambitious scheme. An opportunity to combine the traditional with the latest technical advances, and all designed by this remarkable woman. Well, this is what the Daily Express said about her in March 1921. Woman builder of ideal homes, genius who lives in a vicarage. This super landlady, philanthropist, and artist rolled into one has at last been found. Mrs. I think that's a bit over the top, isn't it? But this is quite interesting. Mrs. Dott, wife of the Reverend Patrick Dott, a Surrey vicar, is the only woman builder in England. Of course, women had financed building projects before, but they didn't do the work themselves. They didn't act as a clerk of work. That was probably their husband's money that paid for it. And it was, their name went to the development. Annabel, the only woman builder in England. She is building flats and houses to be run by educated gentlewomen without excessive drudgery. Of course, this is when the servants were finding better jobs, weren't they? By 1923, Patrick and Annabel had moved into the parish of Barnes in London, where she not only continued with her plans for the Sussex properties, but also designed this church hall at bottom right. It's very large, actually. We're just seeing the entrance there, with its prominent veranda and roof inspired by colonial architecture in South Africa. Still very much a huge parish asset today. By this time, Annabel was in her late 50s and not in brilliant health, but continued to work with her usual enthusiasm. Her plans for Grey Wood over in Sussex included 17 dwellings to replicate an Oxford college with an additional service wing. And her cottages would reveal not only the influence of Toynbee Hall design, but also an arts and crafts style. And there's an aerial view on the left. You can see the half of an Oxbridge quadrangle. Of course, that was the only part that was built. The other part of the quadrangle wasn't part of development. And the building at the back, can you see the white building? That was the service wing. And the quadrangle is the key feature of her Grey Wood development in East Hoathly in Sussex, named the quadrangle. And the cottages have their intended arts and crafts exterior. Perhaps you can see that on the next picture. There was an electricity station. She incorporated all this, which the electricity station provided power for heating and the appliances inside the cottages. There was a laundry, a refrigeration plant, and a massive dishwasher for communal use. Now, why would a woman be thinking that? I think it's a financial decision that what if this wasn't a success? Could it be a country club or something like that? And all these extra services would be a huge bonus. I mean, the things that she provided inside the cottages were amazing, and it was only the early 1920s. So her dream development here was both practical and attractive. The original thatched roofs were much later destroyed by fire and have now been replaced by tiles. As well as the quadrangle cottages, she also designed other detached houses on the site, which had a woodland area, massive woodland area, and a boating lake. But during the construction, she supervised the work herself. She travelled from Croydon and Barnes, as necessary, to supervise the work, as a clerk of works would do, checking that all the materials coming in were exactly has been ordered and making sure, what would we say? We'd say project managing now, wouldn't we? But on one occasion, she was ill, and she was even taken on site on a stretcher. That's devotion to duty, isn't it? Newspaper reports of the development, when it was new, referred to it as the first all-electric village, and it said that there were 400 applicants for the first cottage. Each one is very slightly different. It had been an enormous investment in time, energy, and cost for the Dotts. And Annabel said, "Grey wood is the best of me." Like the orchard development in Goathland and the stone house, Grey wood still has residents to this day. Sadly, by 1927, Annabel was experiencing financial difficulties and poor health, so the Grey wood development was being put up for sale. However, it was difficult to sell property in the countryside, and attempts came to nothing. This was the 1920s with the economic downturn. It was due to the research was shared with us by a current resident at Grey wood that we found an unexpected link to Eton College. You see, Annabel had approached Eton College, who were then buying up land out further into the countryside, to see if they might be interested in the properties. She suggested they might like them for genteel parents who had fallen on hard times. Sounds a bit like independent schools having VAT slapped on them, and parents thinking, "Oh, it's a lot to fork out now." Perhaps the situation then might be from parents whose children were Eton, who had maybe lost their money or their lives in World War I. So she thought this was a good idea. And the Eton archives, they were very helpful to us at Eton, revealed that they initially agreed to purchase the estate, but pulled out of it, causing Annabel much distress. And when she legally tried to challenge their decision, she was referred to in correspondence as that tiresome lady. The archived documents that we saw reveal the disrespect with which her status was regarded. And I can't help thinking there again, the snide comments. The properties eventually sold to private individuals, and today are evidence of Annabel's creativity and design. By 1936, the Dotts had moved to their final parish of Winterslow near Salisbury, having spent a fortune of their own money on refurbishing two previous rectories after Dringhouses. Sadly, they found this one, another rambling old Georgian property, to be in an even more desperate state. Annabel spent the next few months trying to persuade the patrons of the living, St. John's College, Oxford, to sell it and build a more suitable rectory, a modern rectory in its place. She even offered to at her own expense, do the plans for them. And here is her drawing. It's slightly reminiscent of the stone house, isn't it? There's a nice double door in the centre. Interestingly, on the top left-hand corner of the plan, you'll see a window there, a lodger. She did use a lodger in one of her Goathland properties. She's very keen on the idea of recuperating with access to fresh air. The mullioned windows there, the double doors and the lodger, again, what we think of as Annabel trademarks. St. John's were sympathetic, but they couldn't find a buyer for the old. Nobody wanted to buy it. It has now been bought by somebody who has made it very, very nice indeed. But sadly, Annabel didn't live to see her ideas put into practice. Her final letters of appeal to St. John's included one written from her bed where she was recovering from a heart attack. She died just a few weeks later in November 1937, and her husband only survived another few months in that depressing building that she'd hoped to replace by something up to date and fit for purpose. Now, at her funeral service, which was held back in Barnes, lots of people attended because she'd been there a long time and people had known her, and there had been comments about her there as well. At that funeral service, she was frankly referred to as a creative genius who had sometimes been misunderstood. I think there's a wealth of information in that phrase. A creative genius, sometimes being misunderstood. Think of all the comments. People didn't understand where she was coming from. But this is the Church Times obituary in 1937. And they summed her up as a vigorous and delightful personality with a genius for designing and building houses. So looking back over Annabel's life with its disadvantages and disappointments, overcome by determination and opportunities welcome, I think this opportunity sums her up so well. So there was quite a few similarities then, weren't there, to the heroines in those Victorian novels? Disappointments, determination, perseverance. But this wasn't a traditional happy ending, perhaps. However, I think she could be satisfied with the legacy that she did leave. It wasn't a financial one, but an example of finding ways to use abilities and personality with perseverance, which would surely be an encouragement to the next generation of girls. So to date, we've traced no accurate photo of, or verified photo of Annabel, hence the drawing on the front page of the book. The only picture we had was one of her in a newspaper, whether it was, you know how in the old newspapers they're sort of pixelated, of her, 1928, but she was born in 1968, so she'll be getting under there. The picture of her looked like a young woman. So whether she'd submitted, you know, like you do, you submit one of your better pictures when you were younger, so people know what you look like. We couldn't find that, so I'm afraid we have no verified picture of her. Of course, she had no children, so there are no direct descendants, no personal letters. We have business letters, no personal letters, no diaries, and no direct descendants. So we had to use archive and newspaper records, interviews, and of course her buildings, above all her buildings, to bring her to modern notice. And if you'd like more detail than I've been able to give you, I hope I've whetted your appetite a little bit. Do have a look at the book, which we've got here, special price of £12 a copy tonight, that Lynn and I were able to produce. And thank you very much for letting me tell you about her. Thank you.